reaction, no?
That will cause, but I don't know. See, normally they say that vaccine ka antibody आने में about 3 weeks लगते हैं.
Okay, now webinar is now streaming live on Facebook.
Yeah. So we start, madam.
Yeah.
Sadhna, madam, we start.
Okay, start.
Good evening, everybody. I extend warm welcome on behalf of Zydus team Gynext. And it is a real pleasure to have wonderful dignitaries with us, the stalwarts of gynecology from across the country. I heartily thank Dr. Sadhna Patwardhan to giving us this opportunity to organize this wonderful conference webinars in association with AMOGS and Ketkar Hospital. It is my great privilege to introduce young dynamic Dr. Rupali Deshpande, who is director at Ishita Clinic with special interest on infertility high risk obstetrics, and she has been receiver of Dr. V.D. Sastrakar Award Gold Medal for securing highest mark in post-graduation 2007, presented papers in national and state conferences. Welcome, Dr. Rupali, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation and becoming the MOC for this wonderful webinar program. And now I hand over the session to you. Over to you, Dr. Rupali. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudeep. Thank you for such a nice introduction. First of all, I would like to welcome everyone. It was a very nice discussion before we begin this seminar, and I'm really enjoying all your talks. Okay, so good evening. We had our all previous CMEs, which were really a super success. And here we are back again with another interesting and a very informative webinar on abnormal uterine bleeding and a recurrent implantation failure that concerns. Today's webinar is jointly organized by AMOGS High Risk Pregnancy Committee in association with Ketkar Hospital, Nagpur. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome our today's chief guest, Dr. Nandita Parshitkar ma'am, who is President AMOGS, former President FOXY, former President of Mumbai Obstetrics Gynec Society and IAGE. She is Director at 9 Bloom IVF Center, Professor in OBGY Department at D.Y. Patil Medical College, recipient of Honorary FRCOG degree. She is a teacher for super specialty and FNB, practicing infertility since last more than 25 years. Madam is a recipient of Bharat Gaurav Award in London, a recipient of I Am Empowered Woman Award, recipient of Frost and Sullivan Best Practices Award for IVF, and a Superwoman Achiever Award. Ma'am, too many feathers on your cap. Apart from this, I had a chance to meet you personally during MSR, and at that time I realized that you are a very super enthusiastic, very lively person with full of energy and zest. Madam, may I request you to address the gathering?
Thank you, Rupali. Thank you for those kind words. And on behalf of AMOGS, I would really like to welcome you and thank you. It's always a pleasure to be with Dr. Ketkar. I've known her for a long, long time, and she is really one of the most loving doyens of Maharashtra. And I'm so happy that Sadhna has taken on the mantle and is continuing, and as the chairman of from AMOGS is continuing with the series. And I think implantation failure, and that is so very important because all IVF pregnancies are high-risk pregnancies. And it's very important to understand that it could either be embryo-related or endometrium-related, and those can cause problems in the vascularity of the placenta and lead to really problems during the pregnancy. I'm sure all these issues will be tackled and will be clarified, and it was really a pleasure. And I am happy on behalf of Arun and myself, Arun Naik as the secretary of AMOGS and myself as the president, that we are having such fabulous faculty. Parikshit Tank, whom I've seen in MOGS and have seen him really deliver some wonderful talks and do some wonderful work. And of course, Manish Bankar, with whom who's my contemporary and colleague and is doing phenomenally well and one of the doyens of infertility. And Kiran, my vice president, is here. I think AMOGS is doing great. So many workshops, so many webinars are being conducted. And I think it's very, very important because we have nearly 40,000 gynecologists all over the country, and each one has a special interest in something different. And the amount of work that is being done all across the country in various forms, whether they be public forums or whether webinars or whether just discussions, there are some Facebook lives and a lot of things happening. And I think each of us can tune into something that we are interested in. So this COVID has actually given us something that we can access those subjects that are very close to our heart, and we want to know more about it. So I think keep it up. Very happy to be here with Dr. Ketkar and Dr. Patwardhan. Thank you very much. Rupali and Gayatri, good to meet all of you all. And you have to keep the flag going, after some time. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, ma'am. Has Dr. Arun Nayak joined in? Sahana, can you tell me?
Having some network issues, so I'm just connecting with him. So he'll join probably in 2-3.
Oh, Ajay is also here. I think I didn't see him. He will. How are you, Ajay?
Rupali, you proceed.
So I'm
Okay.
happy. Rupali,
Sorry,
just a minute.
madam, sorry, I'm late, but I have heard your opening speech. It was
No,
nice.
Rupali, I want to also say about Ajay is handling the website so beautifully. And since I think 5 to 6 years in AMOGS, and I'm really happy, somebody who is doing the website, creating the funds for that website. I think AMOGS needs warriors like that. And everybody together has helped bring AMOGS to what it is. And I'm so
Yes,
happy to
yes.
be heading this organization, which today is really flourishing. So thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
you are the basic reason for behind that, ma'am. Thank you for the encouragement.
I would like to welcome our eminent speakers, Dr. Parikshit Tank sir from Mumbai and Dr. Manish Shankar sir from Ahmedabad, and also all the chairpersons. Knowledge is a garden. If you don't cultivate it, it cannot be harvested. Now, if you are planning for a year, sow rice. If you are planning for a decade, then plant a tree. But if you are planning for a lifetime, then educate the people. The greatest impact we can make is by spreading the knowledge and empowering them. So let's continue this chain and begin today's webinar. Normal uterine bleeding, a topic which is often discussed but less understood. The bleeding is usually erratic and heavy, because of which most of the women have not only physiological but also psychological problems. We commonly face these patients nowadays in OPD in increasing number, and we are left with a dilemma of how to go ahead and when to shift to the surgical management. Today we are lucky to have the renowned speakers with us who will guide us and tell us how to manage the patients. The second topic is recurrent implantation failure, which is again a very challenging topic for the clinician as well as for the embryologist. Before we go ahead with our seminar, I would like to introduce today's conveners, Dr. Sadhna Patwardhan madam and Dr. Ketkar madam. Dr. Ketkar madam is a director and consultant at Ketkar Hospital, Ultrasound Clinic, and director at Nagpur Test Tube Baby Center. Madam has a chairperson of ultrasound workshop Narchi in 2000. Madam, she is a life member of FIGO, then Indian Academy of Human Reproduction, Academy of Medical Sciences, Indian Medical Association, and Diabetic Association of India. Madam has submitted a research paper of around 100 cases of infertility at Bourne Hall. Madam has participated in various national and international workshops. May I request Dr. Mangala Ketkar madam to say a few words? Has madam joined in?
Mangala ma'am has not yet joined.
Has madam joined in?
No, she hasn't joined yet.
She hasn't joined.
You move forward, Rupali. don't
Second,
waste
yeah,
time.
I would like to introduce another convener, Dr. Sadhna Patwardhan, madam. She's a director at Nagpur Test Hospital and Research Center, Nagpur. She has gold medal in her undergraduate and postgraduate study. She has a best paper award at World Congress Mumbai 1999, recipient of Dr. C.L. Thaveri Award Foxy 2000 and Dr. S.D. Khandwala Best Paper Award. Madam has been a national faculty at ISAR C Create and a faculty at JNMC Savangi Varda in the ART department. She is a clinical secretary of MSR chapter of ISAR, a chairperson in High Risk Pregnancy Committee MOX, national executive member of Fertility Preservation Society of India, and an executive member of Association of Medical Women in India, Nagpur branch. Madam has special interest in high-risk obstetrics, recurrent implantation failure. She has presented various papers and was invited as a faculty at various national and international conferences, conducted various CMEs and workshops on ultrasonography and infertility. Over to you, Sadhna ma'am.
Good evening, everybody. A warm welcome to all the faculties, Dr. Manish Banker, Dr. Parikshit Tank. A heartiest welcome to Nandita and our secretary, Dr. Arun Naik. I hope he's been able to log in. My esteemed chairpersons,
Yes,
Dr.
ma'am, he
Kiran
has joined.
Koti and Dr. Ajay Mane. And without wasting much of time, I would hand over the proceedings to our chairpersons. But before that, I would request to have few words of wisdom from Dr. Arun Naik, our secretary, who has been very difficult to catch hold of in the previous webinar. So I'm so happy he is here with us today. Dr. Arun Naik, please, sir, please address the audience.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks, Dr. Sadhna, for inviting me to participate in this webinar. Most of the time, Parikshit will agree, we Bombay people are traveling from one place to another. Right now, when you called me, I was driving and trying to reach by 4:30 so that I can log in time. But after reaching, there were some problems logging in, and I am happy that I am able to log in and then take part in your webinar.
Thank you.
Webinars have become a mode of teaching and training and having conferences thanks to the COVID. And I'm sure everybody is looking when we can have our good old days and when we can have our regular conferences and we can exchange our views and then we can go back to our old ways of having conferences. But till then, I think webinars will continue. I hope even after vaccination, things will come back to normal very soon. Though there are a lot of skepticism, there's a lot of skepticism when we can start holding our conferences like how we used to hold. But I'm hoping that things will become normal very soon. And already, I think Parikshit is waiting to start his talk on AUB. And Sadhna, all the best for your today's webinar. And AMOGS in these difficult times as an organization, we have distributed PPE kits and we distributed some chickies and to our frontline workers. And I hope we could be of some use to the frontline workers. And similarly, Mumbai Society also we had taken a lead, and a lot of medical colleges as well as the frontline workers have benefited. And without taking much time, I wish all the best for today's webinar. And Parikshit, it's all over to you, waiting for your talk to begin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. I request Dr. Gayatri Rathod to introduce today's chairperson, Dr. Kiran Koti, sir. Over to you, Dr. Gayatri.
Thank you, Dr. Rupali. Thank you, Dr. Rupali. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Good afternoon, one and all. At the outset, I want to thank Nandita Madam, Arun Nayak sir, Ketkar Hospital, and Dr. Sadhana Patwardhan madam for this opportunity. It's my pleasure to introduce chairperson for today's webinar, respected Dr. Kiran Kotakoti sir. Sir is a senior Obs-Gynae consultant from Pune. He is a director of Shashwat Multi-Specialty Hospital and Sanjeevan Hospital, Pune. He was chairperson MTP Committee FOXI 2009 to 2011, chairperson MTP Committee AMOG 2012, chairperson Medical Education, Research and Training AMOG 2018 to 20. He was joint secretary AMOG in 2009, organizing secretary AMOG 2018 Pune, organizing secretary STAR 2018, and organizing chairman FOXI AMOG POGS Clinical Legal Conference in 2019. MSR ISAR MACORM 2019. Awards to his credit are: Sir is a recipient of Dr. Siuli Rudra Sinha Prize for Best Paper in Endoscopy at AICOJ Bangalore. His publications are: Sir is the editor of Medical Abortion, FOXI Focus, author of the books first is Medical Abortion, Drug Regime, and RPL FOXI Focus. Sir has given more than 150 talks at national and international conferences. Now I welcome and request Dr. Kiran Kotakoti sir for further proceedings. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that lucid introduction, Dr. Gayatri. And yes, Arun rightly said that webinars are now in thing, but I would take this opportunity to invite all of you, entire AMOG fraternity as well as the FOXI fraternity, to Pune on 4th, 5th and 6th of June this year for a physical conference, that is the AMOG Zonal Conference, which will be held in Pune. Well, this is a short invite, and I would like to invite now the first speaker, Dr. Parikshit Tang. Supporting, could you please display the biodata of Parikshit? Apart from being my very good friend, Parikshit, he is a consultant obstetrician and gynecologist at Ashwini Hospital and Surgical Hospital, Jupiter Hospital, Mumbai. He is the joint treasurer of FOXI. He has got more than 80 peer-reviewed publications at national and international journals and textbooks. A lot of publications on CMEs, and has authored 4 books. He has worked in numerous national and international bodies in various aspects of safe motherhood. So Parikshit, the stage is yours. Please proceed to give your talk on AUB.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kiran Kotakoti. Always nice to see you and hear from you, especially if it's nice things about me. I sincerely thank Dr. Palshetkar, Dr. Arun Nayak, Dr. Patwardhan, Dr. Ketkar, Dr. Mane, Dr. Kotakoti for the opportunity to share some thoughts about AUB today. Can I be allowed to share my screen, please? Okay, yes, I've been given the permission to do so. Thank you. So I go to the existential questions about life, as we know in webinars. Am I seen? Are my slides seen? And am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. So abnormal uterine bleeding is, of course, a humongous topic. And what I've tried to do is just boil down some of the aspects of AUB into key points for clinical practice. So as Shakespeare says, what's in a name? A rose by any other name would smell just as sweet. We all know what is AUB or DUB or HMB, but this terminology has created so many controversies and it has been the source of so much of literature that I think it deserves a little bit of clarification before we go forward. So why do we need good nomenclature? Because it's the universality of medical language. It's a short form. It's an epigram of the disease condition. And therefore, there is a standardization of diagnosis. It allows us to study, discuss, compare what we are looking at. And of course, it affords historical insights into the problem. The thing is that nomenclature should not confuse, complicate, or be redundant. Neither should be a barrier when it comes to communication between ourselves and with patients. So when it comes to a condition like abnormal uterine bleeding, let us begin with history. And I think the history can very well be traced back to Jeff Cook. In those days, this same condition was called DUB, or dysfunctional uterine bleeding. And what he said was that the diagnosis of DUB depends on what is defined and interpreted as an organic lesion and on the care and trouble taken to exclude such a lesion. So in modern times, what is abnormal in the abnormal part of uterine bleeding today? When a woman says it's abnormal, it's abnormal. There's no need for quantification. Charts, etc., become very secondary. But of course, there are some caveats which we have to follow. Every woman.
Parikshit, just a minute. Parikshit,
Yes,
there's a lot
yes.
of background disturbance from your end.
I know. I don't know why, but there's something with the system, and
Okay.
the computer fan it's very loud. I don't know how to reduce the volume of that without reducing my own volume. I don't know whether plugging in a earphone will help. Should
So
I try
that
that?
could help. So that could
Yeah.
help. Yes, sir.
Okay. Just give me a second, please.
Yeah.
Parikshit sir,
Yes.
can you use your headphone? That will be better.
Yeah.
Your
That's
sound
what,
will be much more.
That's what I'm just going to try and do.
Yeah, please.
Just give me a second. Give me a second.
Please.
Right. Does that help?
Not much, sir.
Not much, sir.
The background is still there, is it?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, the only other way is if I shift to another system, but that's going to take at least 5 minutes for me. What should I do?
Sahana?
We can, ma'am, we can wait 5 minutes, then he can change the system probably. The voice is
So now the
gone.
voice is gone.
Okay, how's this?
No, it has come back
So it's
again,
a,
sir.
Now is the background still noisy?
Yes, sir. Yes.
It
yes,
is, sir.
yes.
It is, sir.
Okay. Fine. I think I'll have to just switch the system. Fine. I don't want to interrupt the program. If Dr. Banker is there, I wouldn't want to make him wait either. So if he wants to go ahead first, and then I can pick this up later. I mean, I leave it to Dr. Banker.
So Manish, are you there?
Sir has joined.
I'll just give him a call.
There are some technical issues. Yes, Dr. Parikshit, Dr. Banker would take up this slot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Meanwhile,
Yeah,
you
sure,
can
sure.
address your technical issues.
So he'll take at least 20 minutes, I
Yeah,
suppose.
yeah, sure,
So
sure.
I'll comfortably switch by that time.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll have to go to my hospital. It's close by. I'll run there and I'll join in from there.
Okay.
Okay. Thank
Fine.
you. Thanks. Sorry about this. Sorry.
So, Rupali?
Yes. So
Yeah.
we proceed ahead with the next topic. Due to some technical problem, we couldn't complete the first talk. It will be rescheduled after this Dr. Manish Banker's talk. I invite Dr. Manisha Ghate to introduce the chairperson for today's session, Dr. Ajay Mane, sir. Over to you, Dr. Manisha Ghate.
Unmute.
Dr. Manisha.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Rupali. Who doesn't know Dr. Ajay Mane? I think Amox, he is the one of the eminent personality of our Amox.
तुझं नाव घेतलंय तुला इंट्रोड्यूस करायचं ये.
Okay. He is the member of National Inspection Monitoring Committee, PCPNDT, Directorate Government of India. He is the chairperson of website committee Amox, worked as chairperson Adolescent Health Education Committee Amox for the 10 years. He was the chairperson of Sexual Medicine Committee FOXY, National Coordinator for Adolescent Health Education Committee and Food Drug Committee FOXY, Second Joint Secretary of Amox, and Zonal Coordinator for Marathwada. With this, I request Dr. Ajay Mane to take up the charge of chairperson and complete the proceedings.
Okay.
Dr. Ajay Mane, please proceed.
Thank you, Manisha ma'am. To start with, I must thank our President Nandita ma'am and Arun sir for giving me chance, and of course my friend Kiran and Pardeshi sir, Vice President of Amox. I'm very much thankful to Ketkar Hospital, Dr. Mangala Ketkar madam, and Sadhna Patwadhan madam, who is the chairperson of Amox committee. And today we are having a stalwart amongst us from Gujarat, Dr. Manish Banker. He is a well-known personality. He is a medical director, Nora IVF Fertility, one of the largest IVF group in India. Selected for the prestigious Dr. B.C. Roy Award, which is for only best teachers from the India level by the Medical Council of India. He is the past president, Indian Society of Assisted Reproduction, ESAR 2012-2014. He is the chairman, Infertility Committee, FOXY 2007-10, regional representative, International Committee for Monitoring ART, ICM ART, and board member, Poseidon Group, member, Surveillance Editorial Board, IFFS, many years, 11 to 20, member, Board of Directors, Pacific Rim Society of Reproductive Medicine, founder board member, Aspire, Asia Pacific Institute of Reproductive Endocrinology, member, Draft Committee of ART Bill in India, ICMR, Minister of Health. It is a very important draft. He is one of the major part of that. Associated Editor, Journal of Human Reproductive Science, Reviewer, RBM Online, JRG. He is the person who suits for the word stalwart. I request Dr. Manish Banker sir to please proceed with his lecture.
Thank you very much. It's indeed both an honor and a pleasure to be invited to speak at this symposium. The topic that I have been asked to speak on is recurrent implantation failure. And over the next 30-40 minutes, I will take you through what is my understanding and how do I deal with this issue of recurrent implantation failure. When we treat this condition, this is true for probably all medical conditions, but it is more so for recurrent implantation failure that we must understand that whatever we do, at least it should not do any harm to the patient. It is of primary importance. What I shall rely on throughout my talk is on evidence, because as Edward Deming said, that we all trust in God, but everyone else needs to bring data to support what they believe in or what they are practicing. Having said this, let us move to the issue of recurrent implantation failure. Now, successful implantation is dependent on three things. One is the quality of the embryo that is being transferred. Second is the receptivity of the endometrium where it should implant and develop into a pregnancy. And thirdly, the process or the embryo transfer technique by which this embryo is replaced back into the uterine cavity. And let us see how each of these three can influence the process of implantation and can contribute to recurrent implantation failure so that we can take measures of improving the implantation. Before moving into the nitty-gritties, we must understand that IVF process is slightly different from all other medical processes. And I call it the demoting effect. And I will especially focus on this black box, which is what happens in the IVF lab. Let us assume that you have a pickup and an egg enters the IVF lab and you do something wrong during the process of egg pickup, the egg is damaged. The success rate immediately drops. Now, subsequently, no matter what you do, however good your ICSI is, you can never compensate for a drop in the IVF procedure. So this is very critical that every step is very crucial, and a minor difficulty or a problem in one step will lead to a permanent fall which cannot be overcome by no matter what you do in the subsequent step. So if 2 or 3 steps are not done properly or the 2 or 3 issues are not good, it would lead to a permanent drop in your success rate. Now, RIF has many challenges, and the biggest challenge is how do we define that the patient has recurrent implantation failure? How many embryo transfers contributes to recurrent, or how many embryos contribute to implantation failure? And there are many, many definitions for this. And this is what the ESHRE consortium has published way back, nearly 15 years back, that there are many definitions. Failures of between 1 to 3 cycles, or failure of somewhere between 8 to 10 embryos that have failed to implant. Are these embryos of day 3 or of day 5? Are these fresh or frozen? Are they PGT tested or they are untested? But conventionally, what every practitioner today believes is that at least 3 or failed 3 embryo transfers in a young woman or 2 failed embryo transfers in an elderly woman would definitely qualify the patient to be investigated for recurrent implantation failure. However, with the enormous pressures that an IVF specialist faces, some people tend to be over-aggressive and start investigating and treating patients at an even earlier stage. Now, there are multiple factors that can contribute to successful implantation, right from ovarian stimulation to hydrosalpinges, to the endometrium, the embryo, the transfer technique, or to the external factors of various thrombophilia. And let us look at the contribution of each of these factors and what we can do to improve the outcome. Let us begin with what happens when you start stimulating the patient. Now, when you do an ovarian stimulation, the estradiol levels will obviously rise. Do these high estradiol levels have a negative impact on the endometrium or on the embryo or on the both? Because we are playing in the supraphysiological levels of serum estradiol. Now, there are many publications which have shown that there are lower implantation rates in high responder patients. There is also evidence that it is the endometrial receptivity which is affected and not the embryo quality. And this is because the altered endocrine milieu of the peri-implantation period, which affects the process of implantation. And when you do an implantation in a subsequent cycle, where the estradiol levels are in physiological limits, possibly the implantation rates improve. So what do we need? We need protocols which are not too aggressive, or if the hormonal levels are too high, we do elective cryopreservation of embryos and transfer them in a non-stimulated HRT or a natural cycle. The second issue is of increasing in progesterone. What I was talking was about estrogens, but what about the effect of progesterone? Because when you hyperstimulate a patient, it is not only the estrogen, but it is the progesterone also which rises. Now, when in the early days of IVF, the patients were not receiving an analog or an antagonist, what was happening is that the patient used to develop a premature LH surge, and hence the progesterone used to go up. So this was called premature luteinization, whereas actually this is premature LH elevation. But once we have suppressing protocols, either the agonist or the antagonist, this LH surge is by and large prevented. But we still know that despite the administration of the agonist or the antagonist, in a 5 to 10% of the IVF cycles, the progesterone still rises the day of ovulation. And this has been termed premature progesterone rise as opposed to premature luteinization, because there is no luteinization here. It is the progesterone which has simply started to rise. There is also evidence that exposure to supraphysiological levels of progesterone in the follicular phase leads to decreased implantation. And this is because the window of implantation gets advanced, and by the time we put back the embryo, the implantation window has already closed. We need to do something about this elevated progesterone, both in terms of number of days that the progesterone has been elevated and also the absolute value. Most publications, however, we focus on the absolute value because it is easier to measure and easier to take corrective measures. There are various publications cutting off arbitrary values from 0.8 to 2 nanograms, but most studies have agreed on a value of 1.5 nanogram per ml. So if the progesterone is above 1.5 nanogram per ml on the day of the trigger or on the day of the progesterone start in a HRT cycle, it means that the endometrium has been exposed to a higher level of progesterone at a premature state, and the implantations decrease. It is in these situations that you are better off with elective cryopreservation and then do a subsequent embryo transfer in a frozen thawed cycle, because this progesterone will have an impact only on the endometrium. It does not affect the embryo. So your embryo quality is not going to be affected. We then move on to the second area, and that is the role of hydrosalpinge. This is a large meta-analysis, pretty old, 6,700 treatment cycles, 11 studies, so large number of patient population. And what it showed that the pregnancy rate in patients with hydrosalpinges was 50% lower than in those without a hydrosalpinge. There are numerous theories as to how this implantation rate is lower. If it is a communicating hydrosalpinge, it is direct drainage of fluid from the tube into the endometrium. But if it is a non-communicating hydrosalpinge, we still don't know as to how these toxins are transferred, how the endometrial receptivity is lower. In addition to this, it is also important whether this hydrosalpinge is ultrasound visible or non-ultrasound visible, and whether it is unilateral or bilateral. If it is visible on ultrasound, it is more significant because the drop in pregnancy rate is more significant. If it is bilateral versus unilateral, it is more severe. So the drop is more severe if the hydrosalpinge is bilateral. And it is also the total amount of fluid collected in the hydrosalpinge, which is. And the ASRM guidelines, based on all these findings, has recommended that we should recommend a laparoscopic salpingectomy, or if this is not feasible because the tube is not accessible because of plenty of adhesions, then a simple tubal occlusion increases the pregnancy rate. Preferred treatment is salpingectomy over an occlusion. And this guideline also suggests that for every 6 women with hydrosalpinge, if you do a salpingectomy or an occlusion, you will have 1 more ongoing pregnancy. So this is a significant benefit of this particular condition. We then move on to the third, and that is the embryo transfer process. We all know how the embryo transfer is carried out. We aspirate the mucus, we negotiate the cervix atraumatically. If required, you do a mock embryo transfer. You should have the transfer as atraumatic as possible, and you do it ultrasound guided. For a gynecologist, this is possibly the simplest procedure because we have been tuned and trained to do endometrial biopsies or endometrial negotiations right from our early postgraduate days. In spite of this, the physician's skill is of critical importance. And this is a very good study looking at nearly 1900 embryo transfers in a single clinic, which had got 8 clinicians working in it. The embryo quality would be uniform for all these 8 clinicians because it is the same lab which is creating the embryos. But look at the difference in their pregnancy rates. So there is something which is called the human factor. Some people are simply good at doing embryo transfers and some people are simply not. So this is something which should be kept in mind when you're dealing with repeated IVF failures. We then move on to the actual endometrium, which is where the implantation is going to happen. And I will look at the endometrium from 2 aspects. The first is how the endometrium looks, or what is the endometrial morphology. The standard age-old procedure of assessing the endometrium is with a 2-dimensional standard 2D ultrasound, where we look for a 3D 3-line endometrium, a triple-line endometrium, functional layer, hypogenic functional layer with minimal posterior acoustic enhancement, and we measure the thickness. The million-dollar question here is how thin is a thin endometrium, or what is the minimal endometrial thickness that one should be aiming at? Most people rely on an endometrial thickness of 8 or above, or at least 7 and above. And it is thought that if the endometrium is less than 7 millimeters in thickness, the implantation potential of the embryo is low. However, there have been case reports where pregnancies have been reported at as thin an endometrial thickness as 4 millimeters. This is another study which looks at the pregnant and the non-pregnant patients, the average endometrial thickness. You can see that there is no difference in the average endometrial thickness in patients who have had a successful attempt or a failed attempt. And this is a third study. Just give me a minute. The slide is not. And this is another study looking at pregnancy rates based on the endometrial thickness, right from 7 to 17 millimeters. And there is no difference in the pregnancy rate. But even at an endometrial thickness of 6 millimeters, there is a pregnancy rate of 25%. So this whole issue of endometrial thickness is not yet resolved as to what actually constitutes as a thin endometrium. Another study looking at pregnancy outcomes in oocyte donation cycles, where the embryo quality is uniform because all the embryos come from donor oocytes. And you can see that the pregnancy rates in all the 4 categories are exactly the same. So the jury is still out there on what really constitutes a thin endometrium. And then comes the whole issue of should we then do a hysteroscopy if the endometrium is not very good. And this is the INSIGHT trial, which looks at routine hysteroscopy before the first IVF cycle. This is not for recurrent implantation failure. But this study concludes that routine hysteroscopy does not improve the live birth rate in infertile women with a normal transvaginal ultrasound scheduled for the first IVF cycle. We then have the extension of this trial, which is called the TROPHY trial, which is in patients who have recurrent IVF failure, multicentric study looking at women with less than 38 years and between 2 to 4 failed IVF cycle. And what this also concluded was that outpatient hysteroscopy before IVF in patients with a normal ultrasound of the uterus and history of unsuccessful IVF cycle does not improve the live birth rate. So the conundrum of endometrium is still there. And hence, there is possibly a role of looking at the endometrium from its genetic or from its receptivity potential rather than purely from its thickness and its echogenicity. And for this, we have what is called the endometrial receptivity assay, which looks at the genes which are involved in the process of implantation. And it has been identified that nearly 250 genes are involved in preparing the endometrium for implantation. And some of these genes get upregulated, some of these genes get downregulated to turn the endometrium receptive. So normally the endometrium is in a non-receptive period throughout most of the menstrual cycle. It turns receptive to a blastocyst for a very short time in the mid-luteal phase, which begins approximately 5 to 7 days after ovulation, and it does not last for more than 2 days. There is a very short 2-day window during which the endometrium is receptive. So what is being done in the endometrial receptivity assay is, first of all, you do it either in a natural cycle or in a HRT cycle. But if you do it in a natural cycle, you then need to do a transfer in a natural cycle. If you do an HRT cycle, you need to do the transfer in a HRT cycle. If in a natural cycle, the biopsy is taken on the 7th day after the beginning of the LH surge, or if it is an HRT cycle, it is done after 5 days of the administration of progesterone. That is the day on which you would have done a blastocyst transfer. And based on this, you would know whether the endometrium is receptive or not. Is it receptive for day 5 for a blastocyst, or is it receptive on day 3 for a day 3 embryo? There is also some evidence that this implantation failure is possibly of endometrial origin. And it is not only an issue of receptivity, but there is some amount of desynchronization between the embryo and the endometrium. And this window of implantation is displaced in nearly 1/4 of patients who have recurrent implantation failure. So this is not an insignificant contributor for patients who have recurrent implantation. When you do the test, you get to know whether the endometrium is receptive or it is non-receptive. If it is receptive, it means the endometrial factor is ruled out and you proceed with what you would have done otherwise. But if it is non-receptive, it means that this patient either needs more days of progesterone because it is pre-receptive, or it needs lesser days of progesterone, which means it is post-receptive. This is fairly accurate because the durability of this has been studied for nearly 4 years after a biopsy, so it remains more or less constant. And the pregnancy rates also remain similar in cycles up to the 6th cycle, so it is not a scratch effect of the endometrial biopsy because results are similar up to 6. This is our own experience in patients with recurrent implantation failure, 248 patients who had unexplained RIF. We did an ERA, then did a subsequent transfer in the window of implantation as diagnosed by the ERA. First, what we found was that in 204 of these 248 patients, it was receptive. But in 44, so nearly in 25% of the patients, 22%, it was non-receptive. This non-receptive patients, that is the row on the right, NR patients, we did the embryo transfer as per the ERA test, meaning some patients would have had a blastocyst transferred after 4 days, Some patients would have had a blastocyst transferred after 6 days of progesterone. And you can see that in both the donor or the self-oocyte category, the cumulative pregnancy rates are similar in both. The p-values are equal. So this means that in nearly 20% of the patients, it was the window of implantation which was displaced, and by transferring the embryo on the corrected date based on the ERA report, you would improve the pregnancy outcomes. This is our latest data that out of nearly year-wise how many patients, and in nearly 56% of the patients, we have started finding problems because we treat more and more difficult patients. And once we do an embryo transfer, even in a pre-receptive or a post-receptive state, you have equal pregnancy rate. So this is an important diagnostic tool for patients who have recurrent implantation failure. But this has its own limitations because in less than 5%, it could be non-informative, and a pregnancy is not guaranteed even with the receptive results because there are many other contributors. Endometrium is only one contributor. And importantly, it does not rule out other endometrial pathology. It is not a histological evaluation. It is only from a molecular genetic expression. The second issue, which is now on which people are focusing, is on the role of the vaginal microflora. And there is some evidence that the flora of the endometrium should be rich in lactobacillus. If the amount of lactobacillus is poor, or patients who have a non-dominant lactobacillus, this is one of the contributors of recurrent implantation failure. And we are able to do this by a special test. And if we know this, it is worthwhile substituting vaginal lactobacillus or vaginal microflora before you carry out next embryo transfer. The next big thing in this era is to do a single cell RNA sequencing PCR of the endometrium, which would give us the complete genetic sequencing of the endometrium and tell us as to what is the ideal day to do an embryo transfer for that particular patient. But this is yet to come. Then there are other tests which have been used to improve the endometrial receptivity. And let me share with you what is the evidence on each of these tests. The most popular amongst this is endometrial scratching, which came somewhere in 2003. This was the first publication. And what this showed was that local injury to the endometrium doubles the incidence of pregnancy rate. Anything which can double the success rate is huge. And if it was true, this would have been a part of standard IVF practice, not for recurrent implantation failure, but for everyone. But there are too many concerns about endometrial scratching. The whole process is not standardized. When should the endometrium be scratched? Where should it be scratched? Antiwall, postiwall? How should it be scratched? With a pipette, with a curette, or with a hysteroscopy? Single versus multiple biopsy, same cycle, previous cycle. So there are lots of concerns. In spite of all this, a very interesting publication which showed that in spite of this procedure coming at a cost, nearly 83% of clinicians recommend it, and 90% of clinicians recommend it to women who have recurrent implantation failure. But what is the real evidence? Very recent publication, 2019, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which proved that endometrial scratching did not result in a higher live birth rate compared to no intervention in women undergoing IVF. So from a very big yes in 2003, now after 16 years, we know that this procedure does not give any benefit to the patient. The second popular thing here is the installation of GCSF, granulocyte colony stimulating factor, into the uterine cavity. And how this whole story started? This started with Norman Gleischer's publication in 2011, where he shared 4 patients who had an inadequate endometrium. He perfused 300 milligrams of GCSF and he observed endometrial expansion in 48 hours, and all 4 patients became pregnant. Again, if this was the case, this would have been instilled for all patients. But let us see what happened subsequently. Same author came back with an RCT 3 years later. Patients were instilled GCSF versus a placebo, and you can see that there was no benefit. So the moment the numbers increased and we moved into the realms of randomized controlled trial, it is now proven that GCSF is of no benefit at all. Then comes the issue of platelet-rich plasma. Intrauterine perfusion of platelet plasma or some other such modalities. The problem today is that we have very small number of studies, and this do not allow us to arrive at definite conclusions. Looking at what we have learned from SCRATCH and GCSF, we should be cautious before we wholeheartedly embark on this therapy. We need to wait for sufficient evidence to come in before we offer this. So, endometrial scratching, no. GCSF, no. PRP, early days. ERA, possibly, and the role of microbes which might emerge in the near future. I then move into the area of immunomodulation and the whole area of various immunotherapies. Now, for successful implantation to occur, if the embryo has to engage and breach the luminal endometrium, and the maternal immune system should allow it to implant and grow and not recognize it as a foreign body and throw it out. And there are 2 types of immunities here involved. One is the autoimmunity and second is the alloimmunity. In autoimmunity, these are antibodies which are directed towards the platelets and the vascular endothelium, and these lead to vasoconstriction and thrombosis. And the 2 important antibodies here are the lupus anticoagulant and the anticardiolipin antibodies. The third here is the natural killer cells, which is a type of lymphocyte which is circulating in the peripheral blood. They have been named so because it is thought that they have an innate ability to kill some leukemic cell lines in vitro. Hence, they were called natural killers. But retrospectively thinking, this is a misnomer, and this misnomer has actually started this whole concept of using and testing NK cells, because these are extremely poor at killing the cell lines. But as mentioned, it is this myth which has been a driver of all the theories around the measurement of natural killer cells. So soon after this natural killer cells were described, it was thought that these killer cells were responsible for killing the embryos and hence for failure of implantation. And there were blood tests which came in for looking at peripheral blood natural killer cells with the thought that the uterine natural killer cells would be the same as this peripheral blood killer cells. This emotive therapy lacks any supporting evidence because we know that the uterine natural killer cells do not ever come into contact with the embryo. They are only in contact with the trophoblast. Secondly, they cannot kill the trophoblast unless they're exposed to very high doses of interleukin-2. But this interleukin-2 is actually absent in a non-pregnant uterus. When you do the embryo transfer, there is no sufficient amount of interleukin-2 which can facilitate the activity of the uterine NK cells. And thirdly, these NK cells are quite distinct from the peripheral blood NK cells, and any parameter used to measure the blood test does not reflect its functional capabilities. So we need to take all this evidence of NK testing with a pinch of salt. And this is what the RCOG advises, and this has been echoed by the HFEA, that measurement of peripheral blood NK cells, either in number or activity, as a surrogate marker of events at the maternal-fetal interface is inappropriate and is no better than tossing a coin. Then what about this other proposed treatment? steroids, aspirin, heparin, immunoglobulins, anti-TNF alpha, intralipid, and the lymphocyte immune therapy. And let us look at the evidence before we put them into clinical practice. Now, steroids have been proposed as a therapeutic option for patients who have various degrees of autoantibodies, because it is thought that steroids will suppress these autoantibodies and lead to an improvement in the pregnancy rates. But this is the Cochrane evidence, which suggests that there is no clear evidence that peri-implantation administration of steroids improves the clinical outcomes. Similarly, about aspirin, which has been used with the belief that it will lead to an improvement in uterine and ovarian perfusion, hence improve the receptivity. But again, look at the Cochrane database, 13 trials, 2,500 plus patients. There was no evidence of difference in the live birth rates between those patients who received aspirin versus those who received the placebo. Same about sorry, am I audible now?
No, sir.
Okay. Let us see again what the evidence is. This is a systematic review and meta-analysis looking at effect of heparin on the outcome of IVF treatment. And you can look at the forest plot of patients with recurrent implantation failure. It crosses midline, suggesting that there is no benefit of evidence of heparin. Same Cochrane review looking at heparin versus placebo in patients with RIF.
Sir, we can't see the screen.
Dr. Banker, your screen is not visible.
Excuse me, sir.
Okay, let me share it again. Okay.
Sir, the screen is not yet up.
Okay now?
Not yet, sir. We can't see your screen yet.
Are you able to see the screen?
No, no.
No, sir.
हाँ मैं वही देख रहा हूँ सर का ऑडियो नहीं कनेक्ट हो रहा
It's the message that I'm sharing the screen.
वीडियो ऑफ करोगे
Sir,
Try
the
once
screen is
again.
coming up right now.
कैसे नहीं करने के अभी तक ज्वाइन नहीं किया है
Are you able to see it now?
Sir, it just shows that you are sharing the screen, but we can't see the presentation yet. So we'll wait for a minute. Sir, I'll stop your screen share once again so that you can share it. Probably it will work.
जैसे नाम लगा पता नहीं चलता कौन है कौन है
Let me log off and log in again.
Okay, sir.
कॅमेरा मला खाली आता बघ हे काय आलंय असं ते पोस्ट अटेंडन्सच्या साईडला हे इथे मीटिंग मध्ये आहे
अभी ना अगले बार से दाखव.
कर बरं परत इथे क्लिक हिअर टू जॉईन करते का
Are you able to see the screen now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, shall I start?
Yes.
Yeah.
So let me go one slide back. So if you look at this Cochrane review, looking at the use of heparin in ART, again, this concludes that our findings do not justify the use of heparin in this context, except in the realms of well-conducted clinical research trials. Then what about immunoglobulins? And again, the proposed mechanism was by reducing the peripheral cytotoxic
Sir, your sound is not audible.
Okay.
Hello.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Hello. Hello.
Sir,
yes sir you are audible
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Continue. Please continue.
Okay. And if you look at this prospective randomized control trial, again, intravenous immunoglobulins did not improve the live birth rate in couples,
the screen
especially in repeated unexplained IVF failure.
Dr. Banker, again the
Sir,
screen is
your
not visible.
screen has lost the connection, I think.
Yes, sir. हाँ है मैं शेयर करता हूँ.
Then what about intralipid therapy? Now, intralipid is a fat emulsion which is made from soybean. And again, the therapeutic effect is believed to be in the context of its reduction in the peripheral NK blood cell activity. And if you look,
Manish sir, Manish Banker sir,
yes,
your screen is not visible.
Sir, your screen is not visible. Please share again. Close down and share again.
Okay.
Yeah, please.
Or else, Manish, can you sum up the last few slides?
I think sir is rejoining.
Yeah, but
As
we are.
audio is yet not connected.
No, now it's better, I think.
yes sir
We can
voice
see
is
him
better.
moving.
Can you see the screen?
No, sir. You are audible, but the screen is not seen.
Maybe Manish, can you sum up the last few slides?
Acha. Means without showing the screen, can he do that?
Yeah, that is
Yeah.
what, no?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, Manish sir, if the slides are not seen, no, you can continue with your
Sum up
lecture.
your talk,
Sure.
yeah.
Sure.
Sum up your talk.
So what we have currently is the next factor, that is the embryo, and this is where there is the possible role of looking at pre-implantation genetic testing, because that is the one area which could be a contributor to successful implantation. But again, here, if you look at most of the data, it focuses on the use of embryo biopsy and pre-implantation genetic testing on patients who have advanced maternal age. And the evidence for recurrent implantation failure is still in its early stages.
Sir, you are not audible again.
I think.
Till he resumes connection, shall we continue with Parikshit sir, if Sadhana ma'am permits?
Yeah.
Am I audible now?
Sir, you're hello, Manish sir.
Yes. Yes. Am I audible?
Just now
yes,
you
sir,
are
you are
audible, but
audible.
the connection, I think it's very problematic. Your sound is vanishing and coming again.
So I have just finished. So I think from whatever evidence that we have, the two areas which could be benefit is improving the stimulation.
No, sir.
No, sir. Again, your voice is gone.
Hello.
I think we move over to the
Yeah,
next.
I think because there is some connection and I'm really sorry for this.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. It was nice lecture, but due to some connection problems,
Or maybe
sorry, audience.
Yeah.
Sorry, audience. We kept you devoid of the knowledge spread by Manish, sir. It is
What
very
we
good
can
lecture.
do one thing, Dr. Ajay, is let Parikshit
Please.
finish. Meanwhile, if the issue gets resolved,
Yeah.
we'll
Yes.
sum up
Sure,
it.
ma'am. Sure.
Yeah.
Done.
So we
Done.
move over to
Done.
Parikshit.
Yes, Parikshit sir, तुम्ही मिशावर ताव मारून झाला असेल तर लेक्चर सुरू करा आता. I can see you doing this.
Okay, so I think technology is probably prompting us towards starting physical conferences again.
Yes.
There
is a limit to each and everything.
So thank you, Dr. Banka, for taking over. I had to switch over to another system, but I think just the day today. So just to take off from where I left things, the nomenclature surrounding this whole problem has been an issue. A lot has been written about it. A lot has been discussed. And it's important to have a universality of the medical language in order for it not to confuse, complicate, or become redundant, or create a barrier for communication with patients. So as Jeffcoat says, the diagnosis of dysfunctional uterine bleeding, DUB, as it was called in those days, depends on what is defined and interpreted as an organic lesion, and more importantly, on the care and trouble that has been taken to exclude such a lesion. So in modern times, what is abnormal uterine bleeding? Well, just focusing on the abnormal part, it's very simple. When a woman says it's abnormal, it is abnormal. I mean, there is no sense in trying to have quantifications, either based on laboratories or on the basis of pictorial charts. Of course, those are important from the point of view of conducting studies, etc. But from a purely clinical point of view, those are not really considered as being central to the definition or in the management of abnormal uterine bleeding. there are some caveats that we should follow. Every woman who has abnormal uterine bleeding is not diseased, and the extent of investigations, how aggressive one is going to be, should be clinically driven. Also, every abnormal uterine bleeding does not have to be treated with medications. Sometimes all that a woman wants to hear is that, okay, this is, at the outer range of normality, and it's all right to just leave it alone if it is not disturbing your day-to-day life, and we can just wait and watch and observe how things unfold from this point onwards. The FIGO gave a classification of the causes of abnormal uterine bleeding in reproductive years. And this is something that is very useful for clinicians in terms of identifying the abnormalities before putting a woman into this bracket of abnormal uterine bleeding. So this is popularly called the palm coin classification, where the palm, that is polyps, adenomyosis, leiomyomas, malignancies, and hyperplasias, will represent physical or structural abnormalities, and the coin, that is the coagulopathies, ovulatory dysfunction, endometrial pathologies, iatrogenic and not yet classified, will represent the non-structural or the biochemical, hormonal, etc. of the pathologies which will contribute to abnormal uterine bleeding. So if we look at a historical perspective, when does a woman have dysfunctional or abnormal uterine bleeding? Well, according to Kistner, it's abnormal uterine bleeding from the uterus in the absence of palpable pelvic pathology. Emil said that abnormal uterine bleeding from the uterus unassociated with tumor, infection, or pregnancy. And if we look at it in modern times, it is when it is not due to an organic gynecological disease that we say that it is abnormal uterine bleeding. So the standard diagnostic approach that gynecologists will have is a history, examination, and certain almost mandatory diagnostic tools. I'm not going to elaborate or dilate much about history and examination, except for these couple of points. In the history, look for typical patterns which will point towards structural problems. If bleeding is becoming more severe along with the onset of menstruation, there is pain, there is an intense clot formation and flow during the menstrual days, and then it eases off, sounds more like a structural lesion. If there is postcoital bleeding, don't miss an endocervical or a cervical polyp. And of course, don't forget the history of pharmacological agents which will contribute to an abnormal uterine bleeding, especially the use of an emergency contraceptive pill. When we are examining patients in the clinic, don't forget to do a speculum examination and take a pap smear, because this is something which kind of gets shied away from in routine gynecological practice. It can be a valuable indicator and it can save time rather than giving medical management to define an organic lesion which is coming out from the cervical canal. In terms of diagnosis, of course, a blood count and a thyroid screening almost mandatory. I've written ultrasound plus. So yes, an ultrasound would almost universally be done. And then we have the option of various other add-on techniques. For example, if there is suspicion, then one could do a 3D ultrasound or a saline infusion sonography if one is suspecting an endometrial polyp, or more advanced imaging such as an MRI when there is a diagnostic doubt between an adenomyosis or a fibroid, especially in preoperative circumstances. Hysteroscopy is today no longer a diagnostic tool. One should always use it only where a therapeutic application is anticipated. Yes, hysteroscopy can be done in the office. Office hysteroscopy is available, but usually most gynecologists will be doing this intervention in an operation theater. And it's important to select patients who have some organic endometrial pathology, uterine pathology, which has been defined, and we take those patients up for a hysteroscopy with an intention that there will be endometrial surgery, endometrial sampling, and that would be the best use of this modality. As they say, there are 40 kinds of lunacy, but only one kind of common sense. And there are so many ways in which we can treat abnormal uterine bleeding that the list is endless. Medical diseases and abnormal uterine bleeding, of course, if something has been defined, for example, a woman has been detected to be hypothyroid, then you would go about correcting it. If there are blood disc areas or medications which have been identified, then appropriate steps in consultation with a physician would be useful in solving the problem that this woman has. But we know that these represent a small proportion of the women who come with abnormal uterine bleeding to us. So we must discuss the role of medical management or conservative treatment. And the rationale behind this is that a number of women are going to have spontaneous remissions and cures. Reassurance plays a very, very important role. Sometimes a woman who is bleeding for 6 days is not very different from a woman who's bleeding for 5 days. So if you just tell her, well, yes, I mean, strictly speaking, according to the textbook, 6 days is abnormal. But if you're okay with it, your hemoglobin is all right, it doesn't affect your lifestyle too much, we can pretty much leave you alone. And that itself can be the cure that this woman is looking for. Of course, not even looking at placebo effect. If you give her a simple vitamin, that's all that she's looking for sometimes. Timing. Puberty and approaching menopause are physiological circumstances, and we just need to ride out a few months before either the girl grows into a steady reproductive age group and a settled menstrual pattern, or a woman who is on the brink of menopause. You just help her to wait out a few months, and well, that's it. The job is done. So initial acceptability is also high. And of course, medical management is extremely useful. When there is anemia, a woman is not fit for surgery, you would have to fall back on medical management. Now, when we evaluate medical therapy for abnormal uterine bleeding, we have to understand that only trials measure blood loss. Women don't measure blood loss. They only gauge medical therapy based on the satisfaction with that particular intervention. There are placebo effects and side effects that we have to consider. Randomized trials are far and few in between, and most women will use medical therapy for 6 months or less. So it is not something that we can look upon as a long-term intervention. It is great for short-term, but except for levonorgestrel intrauterine systems, this is not something that will be on forever for a woman. So a range of effective medical treatment options is available for abnormal uterine bleeding. The non-hormonal options are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs and antifibrinolytics, which are also available as combinations. Both of these drugs are available as combinations. And then, of course, we have hormonal agents, the simple combined oral contraceptive pill, the levonorgestrel releasing intrauterine system, oral progestins, depomedroxyprogesterone acetate, DMPA, and then, of course, the ones which are less commonly favored, danazol, which had its heyday about 20 years back, but due to the side effects that it causes, now no longer in use. GnRH agonists, again, not a very popular choice because of the expenses and the menopausal side effects. So what are the factors that we have to consider before selecting a particular agent in terms of medical therapy? You have to look at the acuteness of the episode, the age group, what are the fertility demands that a particular woman has, what previous medical histories have been used and have not worked, and she's approaching you for some relief, and what medical factors are there which are governing hormonal use. For example, an extremely obese, diabetic, hypertensive woman may not be the best candidate for using combined oral contraception because of the risk of venous thromboembolism. And lastly, what is the acceptability that this particular medical treatment is going to have for that woman? So if we are looking at a typical severe acute episode of abnormal uterine bleeding, the way to go about it is evaluate and rule out a pregnancy. That's step one. I cannot emphasize enough the amount of heartache and pain that can be saved by a simple preg kit. In the least expected circumstances, sometimes you'll find a pregnancy, and doing that urine pregnancy test the first thing in the clinic itself will set things right and set things in order. Consider hospitalization and resuscitation if the situation demands so, and arrest bleeding with any of these regimes. Well, IV estrogens, purely theoretical. I mean, I have never used this kind of a regime in my career, and neither is these kind of drugs available in our country. What we commonly tend to use is high dose hormonal therapy, either in the form of oral contraceptives, 2 or 3 pills a day, or we use norethistron in a dose of 15 to 25 milligrams a day, which is really the drug of choice because it has that little androgenic element along with being a good progesterone, which helps. You could add on tranexamic acid either intravenous or orally to this hormonal therapy. And then the important thing is to continue using this hormone in a maintenance dose. Don't switch off the hormonal therapy suddenly because that will create a rebound and then things become more difficult to control. As an absolute last resort, one might have to evacuate the uterine cavity. This is very, very rare. One rarely ever needs an emergency uterine evacuation for a gynecological patient. Usually, it's the missed pregnancies which will land you in those situations. If a woman is keen to conceive and has abnormal uterine bleeding, rule out a uterine pathology, give her temporary respite with oral contraceptives or progestins, and then switch her to tranexamic NSAID combinations, which can be used only during the period, and initiate fertility enhancing measures early on in the game, get her to the goal of fertility, and that should take care of the abnormal uterine bleeding. For those who are not keen to conceive, a plethora of options is available, and some, of course, as I said, are not acceptable. Some are experimental, like gestrinone, mifepristone, ulipristal. What we use routinely day in and day out are combined oral contraceptives, progestins, and the levonorgestrel intrauterine system. If we are looking at a little long-term perspective, the number one is the levonorgestrel intrauterine system, for the sheer longevity for which it can be used in this woman. It induces endometrial atrophy, inactivates the epithelium, causes decidualization, and creates local amenorrhea, which is the exact mechanism that we are looking for. The levonorgestrel intrauterine system has been studied very extensively, and it represents the appropriate use of this great technology for heavy menstrual bleeding, improving the quality of life of women. Uh, a number of reviews also have been conducted, and what it basically boils down to is that levonorgestrel intrauterine systems are recommended over oral contraceptives, progestins, and NSAIDs, and this is a great agent to be used if the woman is looking for contraception along with relief of abnormal uterine bleeding. You have to, of course, counsel her. You have to tell her that the first 2-3 months are going to be a bit patchy. There's going to be irregular bleeding, and then you're going to settle down into an amenorrhea, which is completely acceptable. And if she's okay with that, there's no other agent which will do the job like this one. One common, argument that is put forward against levonorgestrel systems is that levonorgestrel systems are expensive. Really, are they really expensive? I mean, if you look and compare the cost of using oral contraceptives or progestins or an endometrial surgery, and you look at this in the long term, it's all going to work out to nearly the same. And if you can provide the same kind of relief, then well, it's not really an expensive investigation at all. Is the DNC dead? And this is something that we have to really introspect on. Today, curettage alone, without visualizing the endometrial cavity, I think it's dead and buried. Polyps get missed. You might remove some, fortunately, but a submucous fibroid is very well likely to remain. Focal malignancy gets missed. So this is an intervention which we urgently need to stop. I mean, it has to be combined with a hysteroscopy, with a directed biopsy if you so desire, but just a plain DNC is dead, surely. Endometrial surgery, if medical therapy is not effective or acceptable, the uterine size has to be reasonable. I mean, it can be a little enlarged, but if it's too enlarged, it's not going to work. Fibroids may be there, but small, 3 centimeters or so. Endometrial pathology has been ruled out, and childbearing is complete because, you know, once you've done TCRE or any of the newer generation surgeries, then childbearing is not possible. All of them virtually give the same results. Hysteroscopic based is useful because you can evaluate the endometrial cavity and remove fibroids at the same time. Non-hysteroscopic based second generation are much simpler as compared to hysteroscopic surgeries. They're simpler to learn and use. So that's the lowdown on endometrial surgeries. And when we look at therapies for abnormal uterine bleeding in general, the bottom of that cone is really the hysterectomy. Probably we did too many hysterectomies at a certain point in time, and a lot of these hysterectomies could have been avoided. Audits have shown that over half the uterine are removed that have been removed are structurally normal, and this was in the era which was 20-25 years back. Still, there will be some women who will need a hysterectomy, and we all acknowledge very freely today that for an abnormal uterine bleeding, the best surgery is the least invasive one. So it's going to be a vaginal hysterectomy. If you can't manage that for whatever reason, do a laparoscopic hysterectomy. Today, a total abdominal hysterectomy for an abnormal uterine bleeding is really something that we have to grow out of. I mean, we all keep saying that, well, you know, the route depends on the choice of the surgeon and so on and so forth. But I think let's accept that we need to evolve and go beyond the abdominal route and use much less invasive options that we have today. So I would just like to end by saying that abnormal uterine bleeding is a test of rationality for the gynecologist. How rational can you be with investigations, your clinical approach, and the type of treatments that you offer the woman is going to result in more satisfaction, more comprehensive kind of treatments that we have to offer. Thank you very much. And once again, my sincere apologies for that technical glitch. I hope I have not disrupted the program too much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Parikshit. As usual, it was a very lucid talk from your side. And any questions? Any questions for Dr. Parikshit? Dr. Sadhna?
Dr. Kiran, Dr.
Yes.
Banker would just like to sum up if his technical glitches are over. Dr. Banker, are you there? So today was the day of, technical glitches. Someday it has to be a little different, every webinar can't be a smooth sailing. So there lies the fun. Just give me a minute. Let us see Dr. Banker. I'll just...
No, he's not here.
Just
Sir,
give me a minute.
I think he must have...
Just give me a minute. Hello. Yeah, Manish. just log in 2 minutes and would end up his talk. By the way, we had more than 500 people, listening to this. This program was live on the Facebook and Zoom. So it's been a successful webinar, barring the technical glitches. Are there any questions for Dr. Parikshit? Sana, are there questions?
No questions, ma'am.
Just have one question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By Nidhi Jain is, you mentioned about maintaining the vaginal microflora. Are there any formulations
No,
available?
for Parikshit, that is for Dr. Banker's talk.
Actually, I'm just answering that on the chat. If you
Yeah,
don't-
yeah. Yeah, go ahead,
I'm
Parikshit.
so sorry. I was just
No, no.
typing it out.
Yeah, yeah.
Rest, there are no questions per se.
Parikshit, my question to you.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, we were a part of that Preglem study, way back. We were selected, our center was chosen for that Ulipristal study.
Yes.
But now there are certain references that, the drug is now prohibited. So what is your take on that? Are we supposed to use Ulipristal for the medical treatment of fibroids?
Well, it's really the elephant in the room, isn't it? I mean, the UK and Europe, they've come out with an advisory that please do not initiate Ulipristal treatment for new patients who have fibroids. But those who are ongoing and who do not have abnormal liver function can continue using Ulipristal. However, on the European side, they've still not come out with any such advisories. So, I mean, it's a bit of a gray area over there.
So we still are not sure, So we.
Parikshit, is there any limit of age for the Ulipristal use? About this much you cannot use like this?
No, I don't think age is a limiting factor.
It is the liver dysfunction. It is the liver dysfunction. Basically, if the liver function tests are normal, you can continue using your Ulipristal.
Yeah. But after how many days we have to again see the liver function test? At the starting point we are doing
1 month. 1 month.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Parikshit, a small query. A patient who is undergoing an IVF cycle, she has got an adenomyoma of say 2 centimeters. Okay, which is very difficult to remove, surgically. So what kind of treatment would you advise for this particular patient before the ovarian stimulation starts?
I think these are the type of questions which make every gynecologist scratch their heads in worry, what exactly is the best approach. It's really hard to treat adenomyosis. I mean, small adenomyomas which are, indenting the endometrium, close to the endometrium typically, are the ones which would affect implantation. If they are a little away from the endometrium, then you can jolly well just leave them alone. But if they are close to the endometrium, then you're worried about those. In case they are close to the endometrium, one approach possibly could be to do the oocyte retrieval and freeze the embryos. Then maybe medically suppress whatever endometriotic or adenomyotic activity is there with a GnRH analog. Of course, it's very hard to quantify this, and then come back later and do a thought transfer.
Okay.
Parikshit, what is your experience with, using Dynogest for adenomyoma patient? You see a lot of women, in the age group of 40s and above coming to us with menorrhagia, dysmenorrhea, and a lot of adenomyosis to be seen nowadays. So what is your personal experience with the use of Dynogest molecule?
Excellent for symptom control.
For symptom control. And how long would you go on? Would you do it this way, give it for 3 months, then give a break, and then after a month restart? Something which
I mean, typically I tell women that it will take a couple of months for you to get the best results out of using Dynogest. So please continue for a minimum of 3 to 4 months. And then we take it from there. I mean, I have some patients who've been using it for 6 months at a go, and they are very happy with that. So I really see no reason why I should interrupt their pain-free intervals. So I just let them keep taking it until there's a breakthrough. If there's a breakthrough, then I just ask them to keep it off for 10-15 days and then get on with it again.
Okay.
I think Dr. Banker is back with us.
Yeah. It's been a game of hide and seek.
Yes.
And Banker.
Really. I'll just share the last few slides before I.
But we are promised to shower the knowledge
Yeah.
till the end.
So I think to conclude what I wanted to say, that this is what the HFE has come out with, a traffic light rating system for various add-ons that are being used in the IVF process. And they have a red, yellow, amber, and a green. So red is the add-ons which do not have any benefit or are not considered to be safe. And amongst that are assisted hatching, surprisingly PGS, IMSI, PIXI, intrauterine culture, and various immunological testing and treatments. Then there is an area of amber where there is conflicting evidence, and we possibly need more research. And this is on artificial egg activation, elective freezing for all cycles, scratch, PGS also put in this amber, and time lapse. But if you look at the green, RCT is proving that the add-on is effective. There is actually none. For this. The other issue is one needs to look at recurrent pregnancy loss and recurrent implantation failure. Are they an extension of a spectrum, or are they two completely different things? Are they comparable? So nothing repeated about RIF, because actually every cycle is different. So whenever you say you are doing another cycle and 2 cycles have failed, actually no 2 cycles are same. And a very good saying that no man can step into the same river twice, because it is not the same man and it is not the same river. But if it is rephrased, no man can have the same IVF treatment twice, because it is not the same woman and it is not the same IVF cycle. So and this is where the era of RCTs come in, that when you do large RCTs, you tend to overcome these biases before you come to a definite conclusion. And there is a lot of evidence that chances do not decline in the first 3 to 5 cycles. And all that the patients need to do is persevere, and they will be able to achieve their target. So what is being done currently? Same old test, but with no evidence. And what is still missing is knowledge on etiology and certain independent tests which can actually throw some light on the treatment for women with recurrent implantation failure. With this, I would end that Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. But that is precisely what we need to do. Do the same thing, but do it well and proper. Don't experiment every time. These are the two sides of this coin in this area of recurrent implantation failure. Thank you very much. And I do apologize for this internet. I think even the internet is tired of the Zoom meetings possibly.
Looks like that.
It was a very great lecture by you, and internet is never, but it is somehow all companies are same nowadays. Everybody is flooded with the work, so it happens. So Manish sir, thank you very much for this lecture. I think there is no question, so all queries.
No, I have one question for
Manish. Please, madam.
Manish, I would like to know now, since you have started doing PGT in most of your cases, have the results gone up, or have the clinical pregnancy rate and the take-home baby rates, have they gone up than before?
So I will answer this in 2 parts. First, we offer it primarily only for 4 category of patients. One, advanced maternal age, 35 and above, more so 37, 38 and above. Second is patients who have had a previous abnormal child or a pregnancy loss because of this. Third category is in patients who have recurrent implantation failure, where we always do it in conjunction with an endometrial receptivity array. Because I think asking the patient to spend on one and the cost turns out to be the other doesn't make any sense. Second, what does PGT actually do? can it create better embryos? No, this is only a method which will help us in selecting normal embryos for a preferential early transfer from the entire cohort of embryos. So what this does is it reduces the time to pregnancy. The overall cumulative pregnancy rate per ovum pickup is going to be the same, because without PGT also you would end up transferring all the embryos. You don't know at which stage you will transfer it. So it may not increase the pregnancy rate per OPU, but it gives you a pregnancy faster.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the wonderful inputs and the wonderful talk. Rupali, are you there?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so can proceed with your vote of thanks.
There is one question for Parikshit.
Okay. Is Parikshit around? Yeah, Parikshit is there. Yeah. Parikshit is changed into his scrubs, ready to go to the theater, it seems.
That's why he was doing this. Dikhata hu patient ko. There is one question, Parikshit, for you.
Yes.
What was it? Is gynecologist or something question related with gynecologist?
I answered that.
Okay, fine.
Dynogest is, one of my good friends, Chanchala, has asked that. Are Dynogest OC pills equally effective?
Yeah.
So, yeah, excellent agent for symptom control in adenomyosis and endometriosis.
Great. Please, Rupali ma'am.
Yes, sir. So it's very rightly said that we must find time to thank the people who make a difference in our lives. And thank you are the two perfect words to show our gratitude towards them. I thank President EMOGS Dr. Nandita ma'am for always being there and guiding us. I thank Dr. Arun Nayak sir for taking time from his busy schedule and gracing today's occasion. I thank both the speakers, Dr. Parikshit Tang sir and Dr. Manish Bankar sir, for their efforts to overcome all the technical problems and imparting knowledge to all of us. Thank you very much, sir. Sir, you have made the presentation really very easy to understand, and it was really very informative and splendid presentation. I thank both the chairpersons, Dr. Kiran sir and Dr. Ajay Mani sir, for their valuable time and keeping the discussion on. Very well chaired session, sir. I thank Dr. Sadhna ma'am and Dr. Ketkar ma'am for giving me this opportunity to be a part of this wonderful program and to share screen with all of you. Thank you. I thank Dr. Gayatri Rathod and Dr. Manisha Ghate for sparing their time. A big thanks to the audience delegates, without whom we are incomplete, and thanks for being there throughout. Last but not the least, a big thanks to Zydus Pharma and Sudeep Mukherjee for their educational support, and they are always there in the service of womanhood and help us to give a safe pregnancy. This goodbye is just to say a new hello and meet again next time. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rupali.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sadhna ma'am. And thank you, Kiran, Parikshit bhai, Manish sir, Deepak and Sahana. Thank you very much.
Lot of thanks to Sahana also, to keep to the...
Yeah, I think she's in car. She's moving. See the determination of our not only speakers, the education partners also. They are still online.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Right. See you guys. Bye.
Yes, Rupal has something, speaking something.
Sir, in spite of all these difficulties, we finished our webinar within time, sir.
Yes,
yes. And with a good number of audience. So
yes.
Big hand to everybody. Big hand to everybody.
Chalo. Bye for now. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.